Following the end of World War I, the French government poured the equivalent of $4 billion into a series of fortifications along its eastern border, a border that it shares with Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Hundreds of miles of concrete, heavy guns, barriers, and underground train systems were put in place, creating a system that was entirely impervious to bombardment, easily reinforced, and by the standards of the day, quite comfortable for the troops. Air conditioning, kitchens, comfortable barracks, and extensive recreational areas were all part of this design. It was called the Maginot Line, named after the French Minister of War, and it was brilliant, well designed, and very well built, state of the art for the 1920s. Nothing like it had ever been built in Europe, and the French were justifiably proud of it. And as many of you know, it was entirely useless. The Nazis got around it in exactly 2 days. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Ironically, maybe, it was the French prime minister during World War I, Georges Clemenceau, who summed up the problem. Generals always prepare to fight the last war. And as I was recently reminded, past performance is no guarantee for future results. Human beings are just limited by what we know, limited by our successes and our failures, limited by need and resources, limited by imagination and information. And that is how the German military made a total mockery of the French military. The French had prepared for the last war and were unprepared for the next one. In many ways, this is about as human as it gets. No one had heard of the Blitzkrieg. No one had imagined that armored tank battalions could move that fast through difficult terrain. No one predicted that war had changed. As a human being, the best you can do is work with the information that you have. And if you have no information or your information is crap, what do? Even if you do have information, it's difficult to know in advance what information is important, what is good, what's the information we listen to, what information will be decisive or dangerous or predicted, what warning is the warning that we must heed. I think about the Maginot Line often, which may sound odd, but I do. I think about how the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, about warnings that go unnoticed, and how knowing the future and the past are sometimes loosely and sometimes tightly connected. This may be an odd way to come at a holiday that celebrates the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and mea culpa. But the world of 60 some years ago is just very different from the world today. At the time of his assassination, Dr. King was launching the Poor People's Campaign, a nationwide movement to address what King called the three evils of society: racism, militarism, and capitalism. Many of you would say that these are still the three evils bedeviling our society, and you won't get disagreement from me. But I like to think that at no point in his work to upend the status quo, to end segregation, to face down bigotry, to create a better and more just world for all. At no point did King assume that democracy was optional. In fact, just the opposite. Democracy, for all her flaws, was the source of equity, the wellspring of diversity, the boundary waters of inclusion. When I began seminary way back in 2015, the practice at that time was remote learning, just like it is today. To be honest, and that is why I chose that program. I didn't have to move my family. I didn't even have to quit my day job for that first year, which was great, very convenient. But to facilitate camaraderie, if you will, and a sense of student belonging, the school did bring all of the students together between the semesters for a couple of weeks. They called this intensives. Each intensive had a theme, and we'd have symposiums and speakers, small group discussions, all centered around that year's theme. The first year, the theme was the rise of global authoritarianism. I can only imagine that the planners had the news of the day on their minds. Vladimir Putin had annexed the Crimean Peninsula the year before. Viktor Orban had been reelected Prime Minister of Hungary only a couple of years before that, in 2010. Boris Johnson was about to be elected Prime Minister in England. Populism, authoritarianism, fascism, it was on our minds at Meadville. And then it wasn't. Many of you will remember that 2016 was a turbulent year. The travesty of the 2013 trial of George Zimmerman, the vigilante that was acquitted after he murdered Trayvon Martin, that was still fresh. The 2015 trial for the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, which had also been followed with an equally baffling acquittal. That was very fresh. The ongoing violence experienced by Blacks at the hands of a seemingly indifferent justice system was suddenly fit for front page news. And so that's what we got. And so it was that at our General Assembly in 2016, which happened to be in New Orleans, we Unitarian Universalists voted our values. We voted to rewrite our principles and sources in a quest to become explicitly anti-racist. And then 1 year later, the Me Too movement erupted, and hundreds of very popular and very public men suddenly had to face accountability for, in some cases, decades of astonishingly vile and despicable behavior. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. This was the news in liberally minded and progressively hopeful circles right up to the pandemic outbreak in 2020. Perhaps we can be forgiven for losing track of authoritarianism, even though it was right there in front of us the whole time. Perhaps we can be forgiven missing it in the middle of all of our anger, outrage, and righteousness, forgiven for scoffing at a presidential candidate that literally everyone dismissed as, quote, a joke. Clearly, there was no way a canceled white man, a known racist, a known misogynist could stun the liberal establishment by coming in second in the 2016 Iowa caucuses and then first in the New Hampshire primary. Let me be clear. Donald J. Trump is not our fault. That's just too easy and too incorrect. But failing to hold him to account, failing to hold the hundreds of his enablers, his collaborators, his bagmen to account, that's not unfair. We have been busy. We have had other outrages to attend to. We are exhausted from all of our outrage, and all of that is true too, but that does not exonerate us. We made a choice. And my worry is that going into this year, this particular election year, we're about to do it all over again. Yes, the former president is facing an historic and unprecedented 91 criminal charges. That is amazing. That is accountability. But wait, can a convict serve as president? Look, let's just hope we don't have to find out. So, question for you today. Are you hoping that your justice system will save you? Yes, I am thinking about the Maginot Line and the tanks that surely will never come. Scholars all agree that Martin Luther King Jr. was a believer in American democracy. Freedom was impossible to imagine without it. Access to decisions, access to leadership, access to opportunity. This was the promise of America. This was the promise of democracy, but it was a promise that King reminded us repeatedly, a promise that we had yet to achieve. For freedom, we needed equality. For equality, we need a seat at the table. And that is, at least in part, why systematic disenfranchisement for any reason is an affront to human dignity. For many, the last 8 years have been impossible to navigate. You are, as I mentioned, you're exhausted. You're exhausted by news, by the pandemic. You're stretched thin, made brittle by prolonged outrage and isolation. You have been pummeled by news of injustice, acts of aggression, a failing economy, a failing climate. You have been inflamed by political polarization, algorithmic activation, and media manipulation by agents of accelerationists, by secret forces of foreign governments, and by infotainment operators masquerading as trustworthy news sources. And there is no end in sight. You sit there in the cloud of unknowing, the fog of war, and that makes predicting the future hard. It makes seeing the present hard. It lets us pretend that we live in unprecedented times. Way back at the turn of the century, I was enrolled in a master's degree program at Johns Hopkins. It was government and politics. I'm sure I had a good reason for enrolling, but I really don't remember. I'm pretty sure I was just trying to catch up to my wife's education level. But really, all I remember of my time in this program was one class that I took with Ben Ginsberg. Some of you may know Mr. Ginsberg as part of the team that successfully argued Bush v. Gore in front of the Supreme Court. Anyway, he was a fascinating guy, but I remember him telling the class something that has stuck with me all these years. He said that no matter how bad you think the politics of this day is, chances are it's been worse. So let's turn the clock back just a bit, before Trump, before Bush v. Gore, before King, to 1944 and the criminal trial you have never heard about. In April of 1944, at the height of World War II, the U.S. Justice Department put 30 people on trial for sedition. The prosecution was led by superstar U.S. Attorney John Rogge, a household name at that point. He was made famous for rooting out the corruption of the Huey Long political apparatus in Louisiana. By 1944, Rogge had spent years building a case that alleged that the German government, the Nazis, were actively trying to keep the US out of World War II. To do this, the Nazis had funded speeches, rallies, books, and pamphlets. They had organized and armed militias intent on terrorizing and destabilizing the government. They had funded political campaigns, wrote speeches for government officials, and terrified American Jews with their isolationist rhetoric, tactics, and violence. They were, in short, collaborators, spies, and traitors, or so alleged the US government. The case quickly became a circus and stayed that way until the unexpected of the presiding judge 6 months into the case. A mistrial had to be declared. Facing declining public interest and an avalanche of political pressure, the Justice Department did not immediately retry the case. Instead, Rogge was sent to Germany. There, he interviewed captured Nazi leader Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, and many other captured Nazi officials. And he also recovered several 100,000 pages of documentation. His final report was explosive, detailing Nazi efforts to defeat the re-election campaigns of Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, 1940, and 1944, and implicating not only the seditionists in the failed trial, but dozens of state and federal officials, including many current members of Congress, including one Senator Burton Wheeler, a good friend to the then Justice Department head, Attorney General Tom Clark, and mentor, and he was also the mentor to the newly elevated President Truman. Calling the report, quote, too much for the American public to handle, that report was classified on arrival. Rogie, outraged by this decision, soon found himself dismissed from the Justice Department. There is a lot more to this story. The elected officials with their isolationist speeches ghost-written by Nazi agents, the militarization of young men across the country radicalized by a popular Catholic radio show known for anti-Semitism, the 800,000 members of the America First Committee, a front for the Nazi government in Germany, systematic acts of actual violent terrorism committed across the United States, the disturbing popularity of Nazi rallies across our country, the terrifying presidential candidacy of Charles Lindbergh. All of that and more has been thoroughly documented in the many books and articles published during and after the trial, including the declassified Rogie report. That's all available. If you're curious, I heartily recommend Rachel Maddow's 2022 podcast series, Ultra, for a fantastic overview and summary. In the wake of the 1944 mistrial, the defendants and their political allies shouted victory, innocence, and total exoneration. Despite all of the evidence of their guilt, their complicity, their collusion. They were allowed to fade back into the fabric of American society, their voices still vibrant, their future actions unexamined. We could have held them accountable. We could have held them to the rule of law. We could have identified, charged, tried, and punished the thousands of hateful and foolish, the activated and the bamboozled, the insurrectionists. We could have, but we did not. Our justice system failed. At that point, however, it's important to remember the war was over. The Nazi threat abroad was defeated, after all. And that's when the calls for unity and for healing, those were very loud. They were loudest at that point. They were overwhelming. And they were coming from both the implicated, but also their naive and uninformed friends. Instead of accountability, instead of justice, we got peace. In a 1946 speech, John Rogie said, quote, "The removal of Hitler and Mussolini and a few of their collaborators does not mean that fascism is dead. Now the fascists can take a more subtle disguise. They can come forward and simply say, 'I am anti-communist.'" His words, of course, were prophetic. 4 years after that speech, McCarthyism took the country by storm. 10 years later, the conservative Democratic leadership took their racism on the road and fled the party of Roosevelt and Kennedy in order to oppose the civil rights movement, often in the name of law and order. And I'm reminded of another time, 150 years ago. The Civil War was over, and it was followed by a time of Reconstruction. Southern Blacks had claimed their freedom, their right to own property, to move, to vote. The war was over, but the violence was not. Violence still plagued the South at that time for decades. Blacks were murdered, lynched, their property taken, their rights violated. And their calls for justice, for fairness, for accountability all fell on deaf Northern ears. Northern liberals, it seemed, were exhausted by war, by division, by anger. Instead of justice, these Northern liberals called for peace, for unity, for healing. The insurrectionists went unpunished, allowed to fade back into the fabric of society, their anger unabated, their bigotry unchallenged. Instead, they became emboldened. Jim Crow became the law of the land, and one by one, the hard-won equality of rights slipped away from Blacks. And 80 years of American apartheid followed. Let's turn back to our holiday just for a moment. Some of you may know that Coretta Scott King met her Martin while he was in seminary, a student at Boston University. What you may not know is that they, as a couple, regularly attended a Unitarian church at that time. They were impressed with the Unitarian ethic, the zealous attention to truth, the wondrous dedication to righteous causes. But her words, as quoted in the UU World back in 2002, were the following. We gave a lot of thought to becoming Unitarian at one time, but Martin and I realized we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian. I suspect you and I are both now wondering the same thing. On the one hand, they were probably right. But on the other, what would have happened had the Kings stayed with us? What could have? Would we have been able to lead a revolution of love? I hope so. I want to believe that our faith could have given birth to that. Here's another thing I hope would have been true, that they together with us would have challenged our liberal religion, a faith built on the bedrock of reason, freedom, and tolerance, and reminded us that such a faith is not even possible in a nation where the ideal and the practice of democracy has been broken, has been allowed to fail, has been abandoned. I hope that they would have told us that there is a reason why democracy is one of the foundational principles of Unitarian Universalism, one of our principles, one of our 7 principles. And it's been one of our principles ever since our faith was founded. Now, today, democracy matters, still matters. You know this. You know this truth in your bones. But you also have heard it said that democracy moves slowly, that rational, truth-seeking, freedom-loving people are also ornery, argumentative to a fault, sometimes obtuse, and all too often prone to the paralysis of perfectionism. You have heard that justice cannot wait. King himself said time is not neutral and let freedom ring, that the oppressed have waited long enough. Maybe that is why, after Me Too, after Black Lives Matter, after endless war, after the Great Recession, the pandemic, after an insurrection shown on live TV, after promises of tyranny on day one, after all this, in this, the most liberal of all liberal faith traditions in the history of our great country, maybe that is why democracy has been demoted to a small footnote in our latest, greatest expression of our 21st century faith, our newly revised Article 2. Maybe the ideal of democracy is just out of vogue with the time, out of favor with our elites, out of scope for our activists, out of step with a righteous struggle toward freedom, justice, and beloved community. Maybe the kings would have warned us that a fabric of new words is a thin coat in this winter of worry and discontent. Maybe they would have reminded us that democracy is necessary not only for freedom, not only for reason, not only for tolerance, but for justice, fairness, and equality. Maybe they would have reminded us that our justice system is flawed and fragile, that it has failed us and our highest ideals not once, not twice, but many times, especially so if you happen to be Black or Jewish or immigrant or poor. Maybe the kings would have shaken their heads at the unshakable confidence of our words, our convictions, our faith, just as we shake our heads at those French military strategists comfortable in their Maginot Line. My worry for you today, my fear this MLK Day Sunday is this: the work of democracy, the struggle against tyranny, the work of a better, brighter tomorrow may not be done when the verdicts come in. Justice is blind, after all. However that plays out, the work just will not end with a decision in a court case. At the end of the insurrectionist trial in 1944, no one was convicted. But while none of the elected officials went to jail, none of them won re-election either. The mistrial may not have indicted or convicted them in a court of law, but the court of public opinion was another matter. Making the information public helped. Exposing the lies and the corruption and the conspiracy helped. All of the officials, all of the elected officials implicated in the scandal lost their re-election bids. It was not satisfying, but it was not nothing. With all of the trials ahead and behind, the Me Too trials, the BLM trials, the trials for immigrant justice, the trials of our latest crop of insurrectionists, the trials soon to be faced by Mr. Trump, whatever has happened or will happen, holding them accountable is ultimately up to us. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work. That's Dr. King. That work is your work. It is your job and your responsibility to learn the truth, to tell the truth, to champion the truth. Freedom and tolerance, you must champion that. You must identify, expose, and challenge the anti-democratic, the totalitarian, the authoritarian, abroad and at home. It is your job to vote, to organize, and to become organized, to respond to the ongoing challenges to your ideals and your principles, and to do that always from a place informed by your faith, your hopes, and your dreams. If we cannot send these bastards to jail, we can at least still send these would-be tyrants and their allies home, where they can live their fantasies in the rubble of their personal lives. It is not satisfying, but it is not nothing. But failing that, any peace to come will only be temporary. The lessons of history are often quite clear. Those who do not learn it are destined to repeat it. And history teaches us that accountability and justice are not the same thing. Relying, depending, pretending that they are will only create a place comfortable and elegant and eloquent and state of the art as that place may be, but a place where one day we may be we may be surprised by tanks. Uh,
Visit us at uusg.org.